Too young and old, meek and the bold, ding dong, that is the song with joyful ring, all caroling. One seems to hear words of good cheer from everywhere, filling the air. Oh, how they pound, raising their sound, o'er hill and dale, telling their tales. While people sing songs of good cheer, Christmas is here. Very, very merry, merry Christmas. Merry, 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 merry Christmas. On they send on without end their joyful tone to everyone. Sweet silver bells all seem to say, throw cares away. We will throw cares away. Christmas is here, bringing good cheer to young and old, meek and bold. Bringing cheer. Oh, how they pound, raising their sound, o'er hill and dale, telling their tales. While people sing songs of good cheer, Christmas is here. Merry, 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 merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry, 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 merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Listen, all without them, to everyone. La da 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 da, la da da da, la da 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 da da
Tonight's talk is consciousness, creativity, and the brain. And if you have a golf ball-sized consciousness, when you read a book, you'll have a golf ball-sized understanding. When you look out, a golf ball-sized awareness. And when you wake up in the morning, a golf ball-sized wakefulness. But if you could expand that consciousness, then you read the book, more understanding. You look out, more awareness, and when you wake up, more wakefulness. It's consciousness. And there's an ocean of pure, vibrant consciousness inside each one of us. And it's right at the source and base of mind, right at the source of thought, and it's also at the source of all matter.
How about if we just get right to the business of my fantastic guest that I have here tonight? He's an esoteric and cosmological scholar. He's a philosopher. He's intuitive. He's sensitive. And his first book is about to be published. It's called The Truth About Everything. And his name is Eric Anthony Crew. I'm honored to have him here on Christmas Day. Eric, thank you for joining me on Christmas Day. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas. Yeah, well, Eric and I are sitting here with our eggnogs or hot whatever we've got, chocolates. What more can you tell us? Can you give us a little more of an intro, Eric, about yourself?
Certainly. Again, thank you for having me. I've always been very intuitive, as you said. I've had a long standing history with uncovering different layers of myself. I think a lot of that had to do with how I was shaped from my parents, where my father was a NASA scientist and engineer, and whereas my mother was kind of more of a loose, spiritual, kind of nomadic creature. And I ended up being a blend of somewhere in between. So,
Good. Good.
yeah, I ended up having this period in my life where I was just thirsty for knowledge and thirsty for truth. And I had the time and ability because I was modeling, and so my jobs were infrequent, and I would be able to just sit in front of the computer or a book and just read for days and these spirals of research. It was intriguing to me because I wanted to connect the dots of how everything was connected and how everything really worked around the world and throughout time and history and what we consider history. And during this journey, I ended up coming into greater contact and communication with my father in late 2010. And these communications that he had with me for a very short period of time, period about maybe 3 months or so, ended up really shaping and giving direction to my research. And shortly after his passing in early 2011, I integrated a lot of his research and his directions of his what I've since dubbed his disclosure letters to me. I integrated a lot of this into my own research and have been trying to come up with a good balance ever since.
Well, fantastic. Well, I've been reading what you've been posting on your various pages, and I've enjoyed reading what you have up there in the known unknown. And that's how I found Eric, actually, was I read some of his father's disclosure letters, that he's taken the ball and run with it. I can see that you just keep writing more and more incredible stuff, Eric. I just love it.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Well, so your first book is The Truth About Everything. Wow, let's see, how many of those topics can we jam into today's show?
Right.
Let's
I'm sorry, continue.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that it's a good part of the book that I planned to write, because there was a lot of debate in between myself exactly what I should add and what I should not add, because I have so much content during the period of about 6 years that I've been doing this deep research. You know, the spirals have reached out into just about every single topic that you can think about. So as broad a topic as saying the truth about everything is really, I think, more a literal roadmap for my readers to understand the consciousness that is going to be presented, especially at the end of the book in the disclosure letters between me and my father. So I create more of a consciousness guide map, if you will, or the very first chapter starts with another explanation for time, and then kind of gives you an understanding for how we view time here and why we view time here versus how time actually works in the universe, and then moving on from there, because these things are very important concepts to just kind of mull around in your head. But I didn't want to alienate any audience that might not necessarily look for this type of thing by really only writing it to this subculture. And there's so much so much information available in this book, that I really wanted to make it accessible to people, because shortly after my father's passing, I just released the information public, because people react in different ways, how they will emotionally or mentally, physically, and part of my reaction was to try and get this information out there. And I think it was, it was received very well, but I think it was just a lot for people to handle all at once. There's so much information condensed within just short amounts of paragraphs, that it was really necessary for me in the following years after that to kind of, he gave me the answers in a lot of ways, to kind of find the evidence that really backs that up, and then using my ability in communications to help my audience understand a little bit more the information that's necessary to really comprehend these new topics, and a lot of them aren't really new. A lot of them are very ancient or very integrated in the archetypal consciousness of man. So I think a lot of people are actually a lot more receptive to this type of information than people are really aware of. But because there's some part of them that tells them that hey, this is true, or hey, I've always really thought that there was something up. So one way or another, but there is an actual innate fear that comes with consciousness, parts of the human consciousness, which is particularly controlled by the ego. And because of society, and because of this three-part process of the self, that I like to think of the three-part process anyway, where it's the nutritive, the physical body, the ego, and then the higher being, or the soul, the true being, if you will. The ego controls a lot of our perception process and how we view reality and what we're willing to concentrate on, because
Well,
a
Eric,
lot of
wait a
us.
minute. Did you say three parts? Did you say nutritive was the first part?
Yes, I did. Yes.
And what do you mean? I'm going to just translate as we go along, because you've got a very esoteric view of things, and sometimes people don't understand that. So I'll stop you periodically. What do you mean by nutritive?
In philosophy and certain ways of viewing things, I like to break things down in the Trinity, if you will, or in threes. And I kind of see that it helps to kind of eliminate looking at things as a duality. It's either this or it's either this, and really kind of add a third possibility. Well, it could also be this. And this helps people kind of transcend this idea of left or right paradigm, how something could or could not be. But going back, the nutritive being is the body, the physical self, what the vessel, if you will,
Okay.
what contains the spiritual and the ego. And
Okay.
so the ego is a collection of energies. You can kind of view them as maybe little balls of energy, of collections of ideas of the self, but they're not necessarily true or always true. And if you can break them down and really see that they're not true in every or all situations, then they're probably not true at all. They're just projections of the self. And that is part of what the ego does as well. The point is really to understand this association of ego consciousness and disassociate yourself from it, and really understand that there is, your nutritive, your physical body. There's this collection of ideas of yourself that we project. And then there's also a higher part of this process that you can either call your soul, your consciousness, your higher being, whatever words really work for you. There are definite distinctions between these parts, but at the same time, it is part of one whole of yourself.
Okay, good. That's a very good description. So actually, we've come to the first break. So what I'd like to delve into then is there's two subjects. Can we start with a little bit, since it's Christmas, let's start with talking a little bit about Jesus. So we'll be right back with Eric Anthony Crew and his discussion about the truth about everything. Okay, welcome back to Emerging from the Matrix. I'm here with Eric Anthony Crew. We're discussing some esoteric wisdom that Eric has uncovered and that I speak about in my shows. Before we go into the entire ego structure thing, since it's Christmas, Eric, let's talk a little bit about Jesus.
Excellent, yes.
Okay. So as you and I have talked about, and as there were various legends and archetypes prior to the one known today as Jesus Christ that were identical to his journey and his divine birth and the crucifixion and resurrection, all those things. Can you give us some, we all honored Jesus. To those of you listening, I honored Jesus. He certainly, whether or not everything happened exactly as we're told, he's very real to me, and I experience his love and his presence on a daily basis. But I'd like to hear more. We need to unveil the truth about what we may have been hidden from view for thousands of years. So, Eric, what can you tell us about this legend known as Jesus, and what's the real truth about that?
Awesome. Yes, this is a very very important topic in the sense that there is an archetypal consciousness that is embedded in each and every single one of us. And this consciousness is the attainment for a higher self, a higher being, more enlightened. It's depicted throughout the ages slightly differently and with some of the same attributes, but this entity is what we attain for in ourselves when we want to do the ultimate good and be the ultimate good, which philosophically, being the ultimate good is being the ultimate you, being the you that you can be is to the best of your abilities and for the best of intentions for yourself and for everyone. And that being said, we have these cases again and again in history where these mythological or possibly historical physical creatures were either blended into history, historical accounts, historical record, and blended with the features of deities and the powers or attributes of godhood or creation, or typically the son of the godhood in creation. And so that being said, the Son of God motif, it became fairly ubiquitous throughout the ages. And we see it with Egypt, especially, is a very good place to start with Horus. Around 5,000 years ago or so, Horus was born of a virgin, marked by a star in the east, was said to have walked on water, healed the sick, restored sight, was crucified, died for 3 days, and was resurrected. Mithra was born around 32,000 years ago, born of a virgin, born on December 25th, marked by a star in the east, had 12 disciples, performed many miracles, and was dead for 3 days and resurrected.
Mithra was 32,000 years ago. And now where was this?
3,200 years ago. I apologize.
Yeah, you said 32,000. I was waiting for that. Okay, so
my apologies.
That's okay. So he was kind of close to the time of Horus, actually. There's not too far a difference. Now, where was Mithra born?
Mithra, I believe, is in the Euro and Eurasia area. I'm not entirely sure. I need to check on that information. But if you look into, I believe, European history, the Mithraic cult was actually a Taurus cult, I believe. They worship the constellation and god Taurus, but I could be wrong about that. I need to check on that information.
Okay, so there's Mithra, there's Horus. Who's next?
Krishna was born around 2,900 years ago. Was born of a virgin, marked by a star in the east, performed many miracles, was called the Son of God, the son of the carpenter, and was eventually resurrected. We have Dionysus, which was born 2,500-ish years ago, born of a virgin, born on December 25th, was a traveling teacher and turned water into wine, was called a holy child. So we have all these very similar things, and there's other instances of similar attributes. Even in the Bible, we have Jacob taking on certain attributes in the Old Testament that Jesus later has in the New Testament. And what we really see a lot of times is not necessarily that these figures did not exist, but that they were written with these very celestial origins and for reason, to make sure that they stood the test of time, I believe, in order to really connect powerfully with the minds of people and possibly used for control, but in many ways also to survive, because if they continue to use these anthropomorphized meanings from the stars to these stories that we are presented with of history, and they use these attributes that actually continue in time from what we can see and observe in the heavens, then they have more of a lasting power with our historical record, both I think in the word of mouth and also obviously in history and what's been recorded. So it's very interesting, the archetypal things of history. Jesus's historical record, the research that I've done, the man that we understand and know as Jesus, is very fascinating, and I would love to get into that topic and debate a lot of that, because it's very interesting what we go with. But to go really quickly, because today is actually December 25th, and a very amazing phenomenon happened today that I need to bring to certain people's attention if they don't already know. On December 22nd, the sun reaches the lowest point in the horizon and on the northern hemisphere of the earth, and it seems to sit there on the southern crux Australis constellation. And so it sits there perceptibly for about 3 days, December 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, and on the 25th, it moves north, which about a degree or so perceptively again from the northern hemisphere. And this was very powerful in the consciousness and shaping of consciousness in the ages, because it symbolized death and rebirth in a lot of ways. The death of the plants, which were the nutritive value for everybody, especially in hunting and gathering and things like that, to the point where once the sun rose again, there would be longer days and more plants and more animals to go about, and so thus abundance. And so the sun literally would die figuratively on the cross of the southern crux of the horizon on December 22nd, and was dead for 3 days, and then was resurrected, only to foreshadow brighter, more longer days, which light is also fairly ubiquitous with consciousness itself, because the Plato's cave reference and understanding light tends to be more than darkness. You tend to see darkness being defined more as being closed off to information. So it's very interesting how these manifest.
Okay, let me just break that down for our listeners, because this is like hardcore PhD conversations, We need to break it down. So what I'm hearing you say is that, and which is very fascinating, Eric, thank you for explaining it so well, that the 22nd being the solstice is actually representative of the death and the crucifixion and the resurrection of the sun. So what we call the sun Jesus is actually, as you said, anthropomorphized version of the planet the sun, and that for people who don't know what that means is that when something is anthropomorphized, it means that we project a human form onto something that is spiritual or something that exists in the universe, which is why most people think God is a man, or God could be a flower, God could be a bird, could be anything. But for traditional religious people, it's always a male. And that's simply because we live in the patriarchy right now. 12,000 years ago, everyone believed God was a woman, because it's women who bring life forth. So Eric's talking about how we have projected a human face onto the sun itself, and how it dies and is reborn on December 25th. Isn't that what you're saying, Eric?
Yes, particularly the Son of God, which is also synonymous with the sun. A lot of times we will see certain gods that are either the Son of God, or they are God, and they are interchangeable with their son that is God. A lot of gods of ancient times are actually fairly interchangeable with each other, which is interesting in of itself. But I think in a lot of ways, what's important to take from this context is that there is a archetypal consciousness, and by archetypal I mean indwelling within each of us, kind of like our innate desire to have sustenance when we have a mother, and so we drink from her milk, and we know to do that without really being told it. In very many ways, a lot of these consciousness archetypes that are indwelling in us are present there, are actually triggered by certain stories and certain symbols that are presented to us in certain ways, and they have more lasting power on our consciousness and our subconscious especially, without our present awareness of this. And that's what's really important in getting this information back out there.
Right.
Is for us to be able to dissect this ourselves, kind of like what we're doing today.
Yeah, I want people to understand what you're saying, and because you're very eloquent, and they may or may not be understanding it. So what I want to say about that is that you're talking about cosmological or astronomical or astrological principles. For those of you who might understand that, it's planets, stars, universal events that could be described in science and physics that have become, we've projected human faces onto them, and those events, those scientific events, those universal events, and we've called them gods. I imagine a lot of the gods, their functions were actually functions of survival, like you said, like mother's milk or whatever their powers were. Each of these different mythological Grecian and Roman gods, their powers were related to what was going on in the planets, weren't they, Eric?
Yes, very, very much so. And that's what had a lot of the lasting power, I think, in history was that they had very real things to kind of concrete and place themselves within our timeline.
We've been living through periods of very, very low consciousness. And Eric is talking about the emerging into higher understanding of what it means for the sun to die and be reborn. It's a solstice event, and that was demonized by the Christians and called pagan, when in reality, the Christians use all the pagan rituals in Christianity. So Eric is trying to put a scientific face on what has largely been parables and mythology regarding cosmological events in the universe. And as we emerge into a higher consciousness, we emerge out of the matrix into higher consciousness, we will begin to understand this more. But we need to take a quick break.
Certainly.
Okay, we'll be right back, folks. Welcome back on Christmas Day here with Eric Anthony Crew. So, Eric, tell us a little bit about Jesus and the historical facts that you've come up with.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. So, Jesus, as part of the mythos of this world, whether he was a real or actual person or just a collective idea of an ascended human being, we see that there is a great deal of evidence that possibly points to the historical Jesus as being the last of the pharaohs. And this is actually saying that Julius Caesarion was Jesus Christ. And there is a great deal of evidence to point to this, that Jesus, as the name Isa or Isu, because a lot of the vowels were interchangeable in Hebrew language, was the last line of the Pharaoh kings of Egypt, being Julius Caesar's son and Cleopatra. The interesting things that kind of help paint this story is that Julius Caesarion was the son of a god and a virgin, in that Julius Caesar was crowned a god, and he was seen as the re-embodiment of Osiris and Ra, and he was the sun god. And so also Cleopatra was dubbed the re-embodiment of the divine feminine in Isis. She was Queen Isis.
But was she a virgin, though?
Well, when she became the embodiment of Isis, she became the embodiment of the Virgin Mother Isis. So just by title alone, Julius Caesarion became the son of a god and the son of a Virgin Mother. Also really interesting are the English language initials of Julius Caesarion, JC, and Jesus Christ, JC. But, a lot of that is probably just synchronistic coincidence, but you never know. To continue, Julius Caesar was executed, and so afterwards his son, supposedly Julius Caesarion, there's not a lot more on the historical record of what happens, but the other side of history is reported that he was given to the maiden of Cleopatra with her husband, so she was also a virgin, given the name Mary for historical record, and took Julius Caesarion away from Egypt, where he was safe, and started his journey, the journey that you don't hear about in the Bible until the time of his ministries, where he learned a great deal of esoteric wisdoms and the healing arts of the East.
So that means that Cleopatra's handmaiden and perhaps her house servant left together to raise Julius Caesarion to save him, to spare him from execution, and raised him in the Far East somewhere. Is that correct?
Exactly where they raised him is up to debate or not as clear. But yes, that is it was her handmaiden and her handmaiden's husband, and they took him and raised him as their own, and until the time where he was old enough to reclaim his father's empire from the overt control of the Catholic Roman Empire to the Roman Empire to the overt control of the Holy Roman Empire. And I'm not necessarily giving any assertion to whether this was a positive or negative thing, but I think that this person, Julius Caesarion, who took on the name Isa or Isu, which it to us is Jesus, went back to Egypt to get his half sister Cleopatra Selene, whom Cleopatra had with Mark Antony. And the historical reference that we have in the Bible is that the Bible suggests that Jesus had a brother that was a twin, and Julius Caesarion had a brother that was a twin. The Bible didn't specify whether or not it was Jesus's twin or whether he just had a brother that was a twin, but it also kind of helps with this reference in that Julius Caesarion had half brothers that were twins, and also had a half sister, Cleopatra Selene. So when he came back for them to integrate them in his ministries and his teachings, which were very similar to the Himalayan Buddhist teachings that he learned from, that I'll address in a minute. He integrated his sister, who took the name from Cleopatra Selene, to Mary Magdalene, Magda giving her reference to her birth for the sun, because she's of the royal lineage of the sun, the high birth, and Lean to give reference to her mother's name. And these are in reference in the English language for us to understand. But then her brother and her half brother and her started his ministries. If we look to more historical records, there is a wonderful book, and I can't remember the name of the author, but he traveled to a Himalayan Buddhist monastery and learned of a man named Isu around the time of Jesus that traveled over there to learn the healing Kui Jong and Kui energies of the sacred arts of touch healing, or many of us would understand it as like Reiki,
Right.
Putting your hands on somebody and healing them just from intention and having a great desire for healing and helping people.
Let me interject right there, because I have information on that too. The information that I have studied says that Jesus was known as Saint Isa in Nepal, Tibet, and India, and there's many references to this. Paramahansa Yogananda talks about this in his writings, and so does Sri Yukteswar and other of the great Hindu masters from the past who've been here for. India is the oldest culture that has survived since the beginning of time, and that's because their teachings are so deeply sacred that they've been able to preserve their culture throughout purges and invasions and various different things, and that's why they have so many great spiritual leaders. So supposedly Jesus went there for those 18 years under the name of Saint Isa, which is similar to the names that you are now describing. And you even use the term Reiki. And when I was initiated as a Reiki master by the Grand Master into Reiki, she told me that the teachings of Reiki go back to Jesus's teaching, what he learned in India and Nepal. And that that connection is loosely made in modern Reiki history, but it's obvious to me that Jesus was there, that these basic energy teachings come out of the ancient, Vedas and other Indian gospels. Yes. Mahabharata, that's it. Those writings talk about it. So we're just now beginning to connect all these things together. It's this divine energy, and it goes all the way back to the beginning of time. And Jesus had to have an initiation of some kind to bring this knowledge back out.
Almost definitely. I think what's really interesting is the choice of age for illumination, which was 33. To bring a little bit of esoteric significance to this is that, and a lot of these embodiments of these higher beings, whether they be Buddhists or whatever they are in their nature, all seem to start at 30 or 33 or around that age. And so it's very interesting. But I digress. 33 was even an age where supposedly in the upper echelons of the Masonic cult is that you can't reach the 33rd degree until after your 33rd year, because there's something physiological that supposedly transponds in somebody's mind where they're not able to comprehend, accept, or perform certain spiritual wisdom abilities. This is what I've read supposedly, which also is back. There are, I believe, a certain sect of shamans that Hebrew shamans that would only initiate after the 33rd year, and there were have the roots in that. Possibly some Celtic tribes as well.
Yeah, I can add some info to that too. So we'll just keep blasting through these little chunks of information, try to put this jigsaw puzzle together tonight, Eric. If you look at astrology, and of course people disagree on that, and I'm going to say it again, astrology was the first science and was highly regarded by the scientists, the early scientists like Galileo, Copernicus, Da Vinci, Isaac Newton. All of them were Nostradamus. They were all very profound astrologers. They knew that the cosmology of the heavens is what rules the earth. So it's not a religion, everybody. It's science. The Saturn return, Eric, begins at 28 and it ends at 32. Or it doesn't completely end. It's when you turn 33 that you have emerged into your adult self. This is a known piece of information to all astrologers. I talk about it a lot with my clients, and we go through 3 Saturn returns. And this is a backtracking where we end a certain phase of our life and we enter into another phase. And the period from 28 to 32 or 33 is a very important one because we leave childhood behind. Now, you can be in your 20s, but you're still very childlike in many ways. It isn't because you've just gotten away from your parents and you're, wow, I'm free, I can party, I can do this, I can do that. But in reality, when you go through your Saturn return, the mature adult emerges. It's a very tumultuous transition that takes place between 28 and 33. So even for Jesus, I'm sure he was divine, but, there's just like maturation. Basic maturation has to take place. When you're 2, you still have to be potty trained, even if you're Jesus, So we're going through certain basic maturation processes that reach their denouement at 33. And then even further, I've heard teachings that state that at 35 is when an adult is really ready to understand what's going on in the world. And speaking from personal experience, I don't think I understood just how complex things were until long after 35 years old. I mean, maybe 50. And then I began to understand the level of the matrix that we're living in. And so we're talking about emerging consciousness here in a very complex way. In Celtic lore, when the culture was destroyed by the Romans, the Druids, the pagans, the Celtics, once they became Christians, and it wasn't just Christians, but the Romans in general, were on a rampaging through the world, killing and destroying everything. They went to Europe and with the intent of destroying the Celtic race because the Celts had the power of nature. The pagans, the Druids, had the power of nature, which was more powerful than weapon. If the shamans can control nature, they can defeat the Romans and their simple weapons. To become a Druid, a great Druid shaman, they're chosen at 7, Eric, and they don't emerge from their internship until they're 33. They're 25 years in the forest learning how to master nature and trees and plant life, like an animal or like a Native American. They know how to speak to the trees and everything. So they put all their wisdom, they wrote it on leaves. Did you know that? The leaves was written and they were hung. And so they didn't use paper. They would never kill a tree. They would just take the leaves and dry them and write things on them. So this was actually decided by the Romans that they would destroy the entire pagan Celt Druid culture for the purpose of destroying their power. And so the Roman emperor ordered the destruction of the forest in Europe and the destruction of that race of people so that that wisdom would be lost. And I firmly believe that these are the young people that have been reborn today, and they're here to restore the earth. So, but before we go any further, Eric, it's that magical time again, Christmas Day and another break. Okay, here we are at the tail end of Christmas Day show number 1, talking about Jesus, talking about the truth about everything. And Eric, you were telling us about the Egyptian legend about Julius Caesarion. So why don't you pick it up from there? This is
awesome. So essentially, what we have is the potential for a physical, actual character in history, then the obfuscation of this and intentional misdirection in history of rewriting this person in certain ways that control the masses or the minds, or is not necessarily the true history of things. And a lot of times maybe these people really were true embodiments of, the higher beings and actually were ascended masters. But what we have is often the bastardization of our history by blending historical events with things that are known in higher circles with their true intentions. And going back to that, what I mean by that in any sense is that I think that knowing what time it is very important, because if you control somebody's calendar, you control their consciousness. What you do on Christmas Day is completely different than what you do on, say, your birthday or an average Monday in July. And a lot of this has to do with the sun, the placement of the sun, and also your proximity to, the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, or the equator, where the sun is always kind of directly above you. But we have cycles, and so we see these cycles, and they, as above, so below, so to speak. You see cycles above, and they emanate below us. We do something very differently in daylight than we do in darkness, and what we are kind of just programmed innately from ourselves because of that. That being said, that's why the sun is so important to us with our measurements of time and our measurements of, history and everything. We judge it by the rotation of the sun around us. So of course, very important life-giving thing. We also associate this with great wisdom and deities, and so it's understandable that a lot of this gets put together. But the important thing is, in my opinion, to be able to talk about these things and really understand what is possible literal history and what is not. So knowing that time, that our calendars have been changed throughout the ages and switched from a lunar-based calendar, which is very natural. It's a 28, 30-day calendar, because you see the moon for 28 days and then 2 days it's in front of the sun. It's very natural. It's harmonic. Nowadays we're on a very, very feminine, by the way, and nowadays we're on a very masculine, chaotic, destructive, our solar calendar, which was done by Pope Gregory, Gregorian calendar, and it's very chaotic. It's why it requires revision with the leap years and how it measures time. It's actually not quite as accurate as a lot of the older calendars, like say the Mayan, or just to mention a few. It's really important to understand that the historical Julius Caesarion or other possible characters like Tutmosis with Moses or whatever, the slight variance in years on what we've been given as the historical date and the historical time that these people actually lived is probably only there because there is no such thing as a year zero. There was just a made up date suddenly decided by people that had the power to do so, and changed everything from how we measure things and from what date we measure things. And some people decide to use the date before Christ and after, and some people use it as common era and before common era. And this is an interesting distinction too, because who controls time and what we measure time by and why is very linked to our consciousness. In my opinion, if we were to return to a more natural calendar, a 30-day calendar based on the lunar cycle, we would have a lot more. Every day ends on the same, or day every year. Your birthday would be on the same day every year. It would actually create a lot more harmony in our lives.
Well, that was going to be my question to you, is do you think that having this kind of calendar is specifically designed to suppress consciousness, and that you do think we'd have more open consciousness if we had a lunar calendar?
Most definitely. I believe that the return to a lunar calendar is a lot more accurate for one thing, and doesn't require as many great revisions to its structure just to keep intact with time. Because you see, the sun, the moon is at a perfect distance from us and remains with its face to us, which is a whole other story for another interview as to the many oddities and interesting factual tidbits about the moon and why it is the way it is and what that means for creation on Earth. But going back to the sun, this doesn't exactly have a 24-hour period of time. You know, the way that it moves around us, it's actually shorter than that or longer than that, and sometimes depending on our placement in space, people forget oftentimes that we're not just stagnant in space. We're not just some big rock sitting there rotating around the sun. We're also moving at incredible speeds. Our whole solar system is moving while it's in these circular or spiral rotational manners. And so, you know, there's a lot of things at work with that, but yet our moon stays at almost a near perfect constant around us, which is very interesting. And of course, the idea of the moon being more feminine and night being, you know, whatever, more feminine, and daytime and the sun being more masculine is really very fascinating.
Well, that's really fascinating, Eric. We've kind of reached the point of ending for show number 1. Eric has agreed to come back for show number 2. I think that we need to finish the discussion about Jesus and the solar calendar, as well as move into some of the archetypal consciousness discussions and the ego blocks. Why don't we end for today, Eric? And I want to say Merry Christmas to you. We're going to continue on with show number 2 with Eric, folks. So if you have questions about this show, please put them at the bottom of my show page. This is a very important topic, folks. It's like bringing us out of the kind of indoctrination we've had about parables and stories and what that means, and to the more of the truth. He's kind of delivering really a scientific truth to us. And people may complain about there not being enough science. Well, here it is. We bring theology and science together today in this show. So I'm happy to have had you, Eric, and we're going to have you right back. So are you ready to come back on the show?
Definitely. I'm excited for it, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's my first show ever, so I just wanted to thank you for that. You were wonderful. You're a great host, and I wanted to remind our audience that my website is aquarianphilosophy.com. You can come check out a lot of my poetry, my philosophic contemplations, and hard-hitting investigative news stories and articles as I post.
I will post his links at the bottom of the show page. So Merry Christmas, everybody. Have a beautiful night. Have a Happy New Year. And we will see you next week.